You're listening to
Campus Killings,
brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, DNA ID, Zodiac Speaking, Scene of the Crime, Missing Persons,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
and
Citizen Detective.
all of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
Hi, Amy, and hello, listeners. Today's case takes us to Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. I chose this case because it focuses a lot around issues of domestic violence, and we haven't yet done a domestic abuse case this season. As we know from our work on women in crime, women victims are far more likely to face violence or murder from a domestic partner than a stranger. And I think it's important to keep these cases in the public eye to continue bringing awareness to the issue of domestic violence against women. I also picked this case in particular, as everyone will see, because there is a lot of reasonable doubt in this story. And it was very difficult for a jury to decide the level of guilt and the punishment for the perpetrator in this story. So there's some very interesting legal questions. I'll be presenting all the trial evidence that was publicly available, but we're really interested to hear what listeners think about the outcome of this case. So please leave us a Facebook message or a review to let us know your thoughts. Before we get into the nuances of the case and the trial, let's take a look at the university for a little background. Founded in 1869, Trinity University was started by a group of Presbyterians who hoped to create a co-ed educational institution that would provide a quality liberal arts education to the masses. Its first year, the school only had 5 professors and 7 students. But by 1870, over 100 students had enrolled. I guess you have to start somewhere, right, Amy?
Yeah.
While it started as a small remote village with a few buildings about 6 miles from the local railroad station in the town of Tehuacana, by the early 1900s, the university had expanded to such a degree that they needed more space and buildings, as most successful universities will need as they grow. So at that point, the campus was moved 75 miles away to a railroad town called Wahatchee, and the university thrived in this new location with a total of 800 students and several robust academic programs. However, unfortunately, during the Great Depression, the school lost funding and its accreditation and moved a second time in hopes of attracting a larger group of students. So basically, at this point, the university relocated to San Antonio, where it still resides as one of the leading Protestant universities in Texas. And that's the evolution of our school. And in the late 1940s, the university hired renowned Southwest architect O'Neill Ford to design many of Trinity's new buildings. So because of this, cool fact, Trinity University is on the National Register of Historic Places due to the amount of original O'Neill Ford architecture throughout the campus. And it's only one of 3 university campuses to hold the title of Modernist Historic District in the country.
Let's go visit it. Sounds beautiful.
I was thinking the same thing. And sometimes when we look at these universities or describe them, I also think that, like, wow, we need to visit more campuses, right? You know what we really need? We need more of an exchange program at our school.
Yes.
Okay, so let's move on to meet Cayley Mandadi. While it's unknown what exactly made high school graduate Cayley Mandadi choose Trinity University as her college, the bubbly and kind-hearted young woman enrolled as a communications major at Trinity in 2016. The only child of Talik Mandadi and Allison Steele, Cayley grew up in a suburban Texas town where she enjoyed participating in a film club at her high school And she also volunteered, you'll love this, Amy, with an animal therapy program called Faithful Friends Animal Assisted Therapy Ministry.
Sounds like a dream.
You know, I'm actually surprised you never volunteered for any animal organizations or groups, or did you?
You know, my love of animals, I've had dogs growing up, but my obsession with animals really didn't start till later in life.
Well, that's okay, because there's still time now later in life for you to volunteer for animal organizations.
That's true. Maybe I will.
No, I used to volunteer. Well, I volunteered for a couple of years at a PetSmart. I used to take care of the cats there. I used to go in and feed them, clean the cages. It wasn't the most glamorous job,
That's
but
cute.
I liked doing it. Okay, now Cayley's parents divorced at some point, and her mother remarried a man named Lawrence Baitlin. But by all accounts, this didn't harm the closeness Cayley felt towards her parents. And incredibly, she seemed to have a very loving relationship as well with her stepdad, which is nice to hear. So despite this divorce, Cayley came from a tight family. And her parents said that she just seemed to blossom with joy as she got older. I think she was just a joyous, great girl to be around. As Cayley prepared to go off to college, they described her as being a young woman who was full of love, beauty, compassion, and intelligence. And these qualities would suit her well for embarking on her college career. As Cayley's best high school friend described, Cayley made friends effortlessly, and by all accounts, she quickly thrived at Trinity. She became almost instantly involved in on-campus life, joining the cheerleading squad and pledging a sorority. She was a good student right from the beginning, and she pretty quickly had her first serious boyfriend at college, a football player by the name of Jeff Burcham, and that was just weeks into their freshman year. Since Cayley was a cheerleader and Jeff was a football player, the two saw each other frequently and quickly fell for each other. Do you remember your first romance or first boyfriend too at college?
Of college?
Yeah. No? Wow. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I remember that feeling as well. Things were exciting. You're embarking on your new life, new relationship. And at one point, Cayley told her parents how happy Jeff made her. And though her parents realized that this was just young love, or that's what they thought. I mean, she's 18 and a freshman, and probably not something Cayley should be pinning her hopes on. Cayley wanted some independence and a chance to make her own decisions. So her parents didn't say much about her relationship, other to say that they supported her and they were happy for her, which is probably exactly what parents should do at that point.
Yes, as long as it's a healthy relationship. Absolutely.
Exactly. My mom was like in that camp, like, I'm happy for you. My dad didn't like anybody. So nobody, you know. I was also an only child, and he just didn't like anyone.
Well, no one was probably good enough.
I guess not in his eyes, you know, but that's the way it goes sometimes. Now, much as Cayley's parents suspected, by the beginning of her sophomore year, things no longer seemed to be going amazingly with Jeff. You know, Cayley was looking for a long-term committed relationship with him, and Jeff didn't seem to want that. Now, there was no evidence that the two fought bitterly or were nasty towards each other. It seemed more like the couple was realizing that they just had different priorities, and they were both young. So in August of 2017, Jeff took the initiative and ended their relationship by suggesting that they see other people, which seemed to be what he wanted to do at the time.
Never a good sign.
No, but, you know, it does happen in college scenario.
Yeah, but I'm saying it's a relationship is probably over at that age if you're wanting to see other people.
Absolutely. But, you know, not too long after Jeff ended the relationship, Cayley met someone else. Another young man came into her life, and this was 22-year-old Mark Howerton. Now, I don't have much on his background, but I'll tell you what I do know, okay? The only information really available about his life before meeting Cayley was that he was a star baseball player in high school. I remember this. And that he'd had an arrest for marijuana possession and another controlled substance in 2015. At the time he met Cayley, he was living in Houston, so that's about a 3-hour drive from Trinity University.
How did they meet?
While Mark wasn't a student at Trinity, he had several friends who went there, and he often drove up to spend the weekend with them. Cayley moved in similar circles as Mark's friends, so that's, you know, kind of how they met, with him visiting and her hanging out with his friends. And their relationship seemed to move quickly, but almost too quickly. And while it's unclear what exactly Cayley saw in Mark that made him so attractive to her, several of Cayley's friends were not happy with her new relationship. they saw some unsettling red flags almost immediately.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
So these red flags, well, from the beginning, Mark acted very possessive towards Cayley, almost seemingly isolating her and wanting her to spend time only with him. Not a great sign. Mark was very tall and physically strong, and he worked out constantly, and I think like obsessively, which her friends found a little intimidating, this focus on physical appearance that he had, coupled with his actual physical strength. I think there was more concern to add to that because of the obsessive workouts. Mark also admitted that he took and sold steroids. So her friends were not happy with this. Not long into the relationship, Cayley's roommate noticed bruising on Cayley's thighs one day. And when she asked Cayley what had happened, Cayley admitted that Mark had caused them, though we don't know how. So that could have a couple of different connotations. On another day, Cayley asked her roommate for help getting her cell phone back from Mark as he'd taken it away from her during a fight. Well, listen to this. When the two women confronted Mark, he allegedly took a handgun out of his Mercedes glove box and threatened to shoot passersby if they didn't leave him alone.
Yeah. This is not someone she needs to get out of this relationship.
I mean, this escalates pretty quickly too. You know, we're not just talking about any small behaviors here. This is escalating and getting serious very quickly. Cayley also allegedly told several of her friends that Mark had slammed her head against his car window on one of their drives. So, I mean, you have physical violence here, and you have much more. Later court testimony claimed that Mark had also, as I mentioned earlier, I think, cut Cayley off from her friends and used manipulation and threats to keep her from participating in her everyday activities, so her sorority and cheerleading. This is classic symptoms of abuse.
Yeah.
You know, the isolation tactics, the manipulation. Absolutely.
I'm assuming her parents didn't like this guy either.
Her parents did not like him either. No. But the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, happened on the night of September 24th, 2017. That night, Cayley was supposed to go to a party with her roommate, but Mark, who'd been hanging out in their dorm room, of course did not want Cayley to go. So the two, I assume he was there visiting friends and her as well. So the two began arguing about it on the dorm balcony, and Cayley's roommate would later testify that she saw Mark grab Cayley and throw her up against the balcony's brick wall. The roommate also heard him say that he would throw Cayley off the balcony. So violence coupled with a further act of violence. Despite this, Cayley disengaged from Mark and said she was going out to the party anyway, and she and her roommate left. Mark stayed in the dorm room, and not long after Cayley had gone, her next-door neighbor heard a loud ruckus coming from Cayley's room, including the sound of breaking glass, thumps against the shared wall, and the sound of an angry man yelling.
He was the only one in that room?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
So the concerned student called campus police, and when they arrived, Mark answered the door, but wouldn't allow police to come in the room. Now, after a verbal dispute over what Mark was doing in Cayley's dorm, police escorted him from the room, and they were able to see what he was hiding, and that was the fact that the dorm had been destroyed. The sliding glass door leading out to the balcony was cracked. Cayley's laptop was smashed on the sidewalk below, and all of her clothing had been tossed over the balcony, hanging from trees. Broken dorm decorations littered the floor. An entire bottle of soda had been dumped over Cayley's bed.
What?
Yes.
This is absurd.
This is absurd. Mark was removed from the building, and when Cayley returned and was interviewed, she was described as distraught at the damage and reiterated what cops had already suspected. The dorm had not looked like that when she'd left for the party. Mark Howerton was charged with criminal mischief and trespassing, and he was banned from the campus for a year. Though, interestingly, Amy, it was up to Cayley to pay the $1,500 to cover the damages that Mark had inflicted on her dorm room, which included replacing the glass door and her bed.
That's strange.
Well, it's unfairly punitive to a victim, for sure. After this incident, Cayley cut off all contact with Mark, refusing to answer his texts, snaps, or other social media messages. What the hell is a snap? Is that like Snapchat?
Snapchat.
And at this point, she began rekindling her relationship with her ex-boyfriend Jeff as well. Just kind of an interesting turn of events. According to court documents, Cayley had actually continued to see Jeff throughout her budding relationship with Mark, but it's unclear if they were seeing each other just as friends or if there was still a romance going on. Jeff was still interested in Cayley. He just wasn't sure about the long-term serious commitment at this point. Either way, court documents revealed that Mark and Jeff both knew that Cayley was essentially seeing them at the same time, and neither one of them were happy about it, but she was honest about it. Although Jeff would later testify that after the dorm room incident, Cayley contacted him to say she was done with Mark. And at that point, Jeff says she wanted to rekindle their romance. She was more interested in pursuing a relationship with him. So she told Jeff that she was going to officially end things with Mark at the upcoming Mala Luna Music Festival because it was a public place with a lot of witnesses, and she was afraid of what Mark would do when she dumped him.
Oh, jeez.
However, a few weeks before the music festival, Mark sent Cayley a Snapchat photograph of himself in which he had a handgun in his mouth with a caption that said he would kill himself if Cayley didn't start talking to him.
Oh, jeez.
Very manipulative behavior as well, threatening self-harm to coerce his victim. As her stepfather told 48 Hours, he was never going to kill himself. He was manipulating her. But Cayley was 19 years old, only ever had one boyfriend, and she was such a big-hearted, kind young woman. She was unable to see through Mark's manipulation, and she began to talk to him again. So his plan worked. And on Sunday, October 29th, 2017, Mark picked Cayley up to go to the Mala Luna Music Festival. On the way, Mark stopped off at a car wash, and he took out a bag of MDMA, also known as Molly or ecstasy. So he and Cayley both took some and then continued driving to the festival. Now, according to Cayley's parents, this wasn't the first time she had done MDMA. She was known to recreationally use it and marijuana at school, which was a source of contention between her and her parents, but apparently Cayley was honest about this. Regardless, though, Mark and Cayley got to the festival and spent the day watching the shows, drinking large quantities of alcohol, and ingesting MDMA. It's unknown whether Cayley still wanted to break up with Mark at this juncture, but things escalated when Mark saw her ex, Jeff, was also at the festival and hanging out kind of nearby. Jeff would later testify that he saw things become tense between Cayley and Mark, with Cayley trying to create space and Mark wrapping his arm around her shoulder and pulling her away from the festivities. However, Jeff was the only witness to see this, and as we'll see later, his testimony became a huge point of contention during the trial. What happens next? Amy is really only known through Mark's testimony, so it's not clear how much of it's true, and we'll break more of that down as we talk about the trial. But let's start here. According to Mark's interview with the police, after seeing Jeff at the festival, Mark and Cayley decided to leave. They argued on the ride back to Mark's apartment in Houston, which was around 3 hours away, as I had said earlier, in which Cayley said she was still in love with Jeff, and Mark later admitted to investigators that he yelled at her about getting over Jeff and how he and all her friends were fake. This was the argument. He told the police that after the fight had cooled, he pulled into a gas station and the two had consensual makeup sex, though he admitted that it quickly became rough. Now, it's not clear if rough sexual behavior was normal for this couple or not, but after they'd finished, Mark continued driving towards Houston. According to Mark, Cayley said she wasn't feeling well and that she fell asleep and began snoring. But about an hour into the drive, Mark noticed she'd stopped snoring and was unresponsive. He felt at her neck and didn't feel a pulse, so he pulled off at the first sign for a hospital and ran into the lobby looking for EMTs. A first responder followed him out to the car park where Cayley was still in the passenger seat. During the trial, the EMT testified that the scene she encountered was incredibly disturbing. Cayley was naked from the waist down, her pants and underwear down around her ankles, and her shirt and bra had been pulled up almost to her clavicle. As the EMT began CPR, she also noticed that Cayley had bruises on her legs.
We'll return after a brief word from our sponsors.
As Cayley was brought into the hospital, Mark informed doctors that he and Cayley had ingested a large quantity of ecstasy and alcohol. And so initially, doctors treated Cayley for a potential drug overdose, placing her on a ventilator. Doctors worked for several hours to revive her, restarting her heart 7 times. But though they got a pulse back, she had no brain activity. Her parents were called, and upon their arrival, doctors informed them that Cayley was brain dead. As Cayley was an organ donor, her parents made the very difficult decision to take her off life support and let her organs be used to help other people.
So right now they're thinking this is a drug overdose or something with substance.
Yeah, that's right, Amy. Right now they are thinking that.
I have a feeling that's going to change.
Yes, it will change. But right now, unfortunately, Cayley Mandadi was pronounced dead on October 31st, 2017. Now, during the immediate minutes upon their arrival to the hospital, police took Mark into the hospital chapel to interview him. And during that time, he told the story about how Cayley had come to need medical assistance, the events that I just described. When pressed if he had ever hit Cayley, so they were suspicious of him, Mark admitted that he had pushed Cayley in the past and that in rough sex, he had slapped her, but he had never punched her before. The police took photos of him, though, and found that his knuckles looked very red and that he had a few scratches on his arm. So it's good they took the photos right away. Regardless, Mark was cooperative, allowing police to search his Mercedes and giving them access to his phone. He was also clearly concerned about Cayley's condition during the interview and repeatedly asked for updates on her. It's kind of a criticism we hear during interviews. You've heard that before, right? Like he or she never asked about the other person's condition.
Yeah, but I also think it's one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't situations.
I agree.
Because you could be faking concern or, it's always going to be scrutinized.
I agree. After her death, police talked to Mark a few more times, by which point they knew that he hadn't told them everything. His cell phone locations did not totally match his story. And when pressed, he came clean that he and Cayley had not had sex at the gas station, as he'd originally said. Instead, he said they'd stopped at a vacant hotel parking lot for their sexual encounter, and that the stop at the gas station was about an hour later.
Why is he lying about this?
That's exactly the question. This not only made it seem suspicious, too, that Cayley had been undressed in such a state for that long after this encounter, but if Mark had been completely truthful about this insignificant detail, police wondered what else he might be holding back. What was the reason? But despite rising suspicions, the police didn't have enough evidence to point to anything really sinister, and Cayley's autopsy results had not yet been released. So it's just suspicions at this point. But that would all change 3 months later when the autopsy report came in.
That's a long time.
It is a long time. So there was some information about this. She was originally thought to have overdosed, but remember, she was an organ donor, and I guess her organs would all have to be harvested before her body was sent to the medical examiner, so I believe that caused a delay. There might have been other reasons for a delay, and also the report only became public at this time. It might have been issued earlier, but it's a good question. What it revealed was that Cayley's death had not been ruled an overdose, as had been expected. The ME reported her cause of death as blunt force trauma to the face and the head, which meant it was classified as a homicide.
Did she also have high levels of drugs in her system?
She did have drugs in her system. I'm not sure what the exact level was.
Okay.
Police began investigating Mark and Cayley's relationship again, and based on their findings, a month after the medical examiner's ruling, Mark Howerton was arrested for the kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder of Cayley Mandadi. All right, this case went to trial in 2019 after a grand jury indicted Mark for murder. I didn't find any evidence of him being offered a plea, so I'm not sure if he refused a plea or if the prosecution just didn't offer him one. Televised and heavily covered in the media, the whole state of Texas watched as Mark Howerton pled not guilty to beating, sexually assaulting, and ultimately murdering his girlfriend of 2 months. This is a 2-month relationship. Very short.
I don't think I realized it was that short.
I didn't either at first. The prosecution made a strong case for Howerton's guilt, with many of Cayley's friends and neighbors being called to the stand to testify about Mark's abusive behavior, as well as to attest to his use of steroids. So this clearly does not paint a very good picture of Mark. They also brought in the medical examiner who'd conducted the autopsy and showed those autopsy photos to the jury. Now, sometimes this can be considered inflammatory. You know, it's not really indicative of one's guilt. But in this case, I think they needed to see these photos to decipher between the injuries that she had and what Mark's story is. In these images, it was clear that Cayley's body was covered in bruises along her arms and legs. She also had bruising behind her ear and on the side of her skull just above her ear. Interior photos of the skull showed the fracture line the medical examiner claimed had killed Cayley. But the prosecution's star witness was Cayley's ex-boyfriend. Remember Jeff Burcham?
Mm-hmm.
At the grand jury trial, Jeff had testified that he'd seen Mark stuff Cayley into his Mercedes against her will on the day of that music festival, and that clinching piece of evidence made Jeff seemingly the most important witness for the prosecution. However, Mark Howerton had a very good defense lawyer whose scheme on the stand was not to prove to the jury that Mark was an upstanding guy per se, but that just because he was a bad boyfriend didn't mean he was a murderer. To start, the defense eviscerated Jeff Burcham in their cross-examination. Based on where the parking lot of the music festival was located and Jeff's cell phone records from the day, Jeff didn't appear to have been anywhere near the parking lot when Mark and Cayley left the festival. And so the defense was trying to show, and I think they did a good job, that there was really no way Jeff could have seen Cayley being stuffed into a vehicle, as he testified.
It's so funny. Like I find it so interesting when these things come up, because I don't think that bit is even really relevant to the bottom line here.
Well, I mean, it depends on, I understand what you're saying. Is it the piece of evidence that shows that there was a murder? No, but is it part of the picture that shows the relationship was volatile and they were already fighting and there was already anger ahead of time, which leads up to possibly a murder?
Mm-hmm.
Right. But I do understand your point completely.
Yeah.
And by the way, Jeff did admit he'd exaggerated his story to the grand jury and that he didn't actually see the couple getting into their car.
Oh, geez.
He had seen them before then.
All right.
To further ruin Jeff's credibility, by the way, the defense brought up a Title IX investigation that Trinity University had on him for a sexual harassment case of his own. So that just did not look good for credibility purposes.
Okay.
As well as the fact that Jeff also had an active case open for being a marijuana distributor on Trinity's campus.
I still don't see how. I understand why it's brought up, but I don't think it changes like the evidence that she had all those bruises on her body.
I don't think so as well. But what they're aiming to do here is show that this guy can't be trusted. He's a liar too, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Jeff was cross-examined for about 45 minutes. And then in that time, Amy, he pled the fifth, I'll take the fifth, which means the right not to self-incriminate, 30 times. So while you're not wrong that this might not be relevant, this is not a good look for the jury. Secondly, the defense went after Jeff, the defense went after the autopsy report, saying that aside from the first EMT who had noticed bruising on Cayley's legs when she performed CPR, no other medical personnel noted or claimed to have seen bruises on the rest of Cayley's body when she was brought into the hospital. So they're not seeing the injuries at first.
I don't know how relevant this is, but there are times where like you hit your leg and it takes like a day for a bruise to show up, right?
Yeah, but if she was deceased, the bruising, I'm sorry, maybe I'm confused. It takes a day, but the bruising wouldn't show up after she was deceased.
Oh.
So the EMT who actually was the EMT who first performed CPR was the one who noted the bruising, but shortly after,
Gotcha.
Remember Cayley wasn't alive for very long, and maybe that's why you're asking, but shortly after, no one else noted the bruising.
Gotcha. Okay.
The defense brought in their own medical examiner to refute the claims of the prosecution, saying that it was possible that Cayley's heavy bruising, as we just point out, might have come from life-saving measures performed by her doctors later on after the EMT saw her, or later by the process used to harvest her organs.
Oh.
So I guess that would mean that bruising could be caused after, if they're talking about during the harvesting process.
I guess. I'm also imagining that there's research on whether or not those processes cause bruising.
Oh, I would imagine so.
Yeah.
I think that the defense, though, is bringing up some reasonable possibilities and really introducing some reasonable doubt here.
Yeah.
They also argued the crack in her skull could have actually been a brain hemorrhage caused by the large quantities of MDMA Cayley had ingested. So as you had asked, I don't know the specific amount, but they were able to show that she had a good amount in her system.
Okay.
While perhaps not a slam dunk for the defense, it created enough reasonable doubt that after 10 hours of deliberation, the jury came back unable to make a decision, and the judge declared a mistrial.
Oh.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors.
Obviously, Cayley's family was devastated, and when the prosecution said they were determined to try Mark a second time, the Mandadi family decided to do some investigating of their own. Cayley's mother and stepfather, both scientists, decided to see if they could unpack what exactly had happened to Cayley on that last fatal car ride. Her stepfather went so far as to track down Mark Howerton's Mercedes, which he sold quite quickly after Cayley's death. And get this, her stepfather bought the car back from the new owner. And based off the autopsy photos, he tried to reconstruct possible scenarios for how Cayley might have gotten bruising and a skull fracture on the right side of her head. With technology from NASA, Cayley's autopsy photos, and some mathematical trajectories, Cayley's stepfather determined that the only way for Cayley to have sustained her fatal injury would have been for Mark to have pushed her head into the passenger door locking mechanism. This was kind of interesting. So the lock on Mark's door did not sit flush into the door, and a small knob about a half inch stuck up from the door, which is kind of how you could tell. Based on the way Cayley had been sitting in the seat, if Mark had pushed her head, it would have landed with severe force against the half-inch lock. Cayley's parents even hired a few actors to stage this possible scenario and filmed it to show the later jury, or for the possibility of that. Now, Mark's defense team knew that the prosecution would try him a second time, so his lawyer filed several appeals to get the whole case thrown out on the grounds that the prosecution's star witness in both the trial and the grand jury hearing had lied under oath. So that's Jeff Burcham. But though Mark's defense team appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court, it was ultimately ruled that the prosecution was well within their right to retry Mark Howerton. And with that, Mark's second trial began in May of 2023. And while the prosecution took a similar angle to the first trial, they changed a few things, a few key things this time.
Let me guess. They didn't have Jeff testify.
There you go. So smart. Jeff Burcham was not invited back to testify. Okay. The second was that they shifted their focus away from showing how Mark Howerton had been an abuser, so less evidence of the abuse and more on the autopsy report and the cause of death. Now, I'm not sure why they would have done that per se. Maybe they just thought they weren't making the connection between abuse and murder. You know, the defense, if you remember, argued, yes, he was abusive. Maybe they conceded it too easily, and that did not make him a murderer. I guess focusing more on the science, you might say. The only way for Cayley to have died of blunt force trauma was to have had blunt force used upon her, and the only person who could have done that between the festival and her arrival at the hospital was Mark Howerton. So they're focusing again on the ME report and the fact that Mark's the only person who could have done this. They also brought in a second opinion of the autopsy for confirmation of its validity. However, that video that Cayley's parents made about their own research was ultimately not shown to the jury, which I don't think is terribly surprising.
No, you can't. I mean, I don't think any trial would allow that. It's just that's doing your own experiment.
Which, you know what's interesting? The judge was going to allow it, but the judge's ruling was that if it was shown, both of her parents would have to testify to, I guess, substantiate the things that were done. And if they did, they'd be barred from watching the trial from the audience. So it was a choice they had to make. Show the video and lose your seat at the trial, or don't show it and be present for the entire proceeding.
And they decided the latter. I'm assuming.
That's correct.
Okay.
In the end, they felt that the prosecution had enough and that they would rather sit through the trial. And once again, Amy, the defense did supply a lot of reasonable doubt. They brought out a toxicology expert to argue that the MDMA Cayley consumed could have increased the heart rate and blood pressure, resulting in a brain bleed and bruising, as well as evidence that Mark could not have had criminal intent because he was the one who took Cayley to the hospital and got her help.
That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I don't think so as well. Maybe it's not intent, but maybe they were, their argument was, well, look, if he wanted to kill her, why would he have then tried to save her life afterwards?
Well, because he probably realized afterwards, like, oh, that wasn't good.
Absolutely. I think even if you have a plan, or I don't actually think he did plan anything, but when you realize sometimes the actions, seeing someone unresponsive, realizing I've just possibly killed this person, you cannot measure. We cannot reasonably expect what a person will do to react. The defense reiterated their previous stance on Cayley's bruising coming from life-saving measures and the organ harvesting. However, the defense's strategy of reasonable doubt was not strong enough to hang a second jury. But it wasn't the slam dunk the prosecution hoped for either. The jury did not find Mark guilty of murder. They found him guilty of aggravated assault, for which he was sentenced to Texas's maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. He'll be eligible for parole in 2033.
He'll still be pretty young, right? How old is he?
I don't remember. He was 22.
22, 30. Okay.
So it's a maximum sentence of 20 years. So he's eligible for parole in 10 years. He'll be in his 30s. No, he'll be young. He'll be younger than us.
Yeah.
He will be in his 30s when he is eligible for parole.
Okay.
But as you and I know, there's a lot that could happen in between there, and we have to see what he does with his time. Okay, while Cayley's family wasn't completely satisfied with the results of the trial, they believe the prosecution did their best, and they're happy that Mark will serve an amount of time in prison for his crimes. And again, this case was one where there was real doubt, and I think it did come to intent and what actually happened exactly. Cayley's family have since turned their grief into action, launching the nonprofit Cayley's Calling, which seeks to save the lives of endangered and missing persons through public education, advocacy, and law enforcement. So basically, through their nonprofit, Cayley's mom and stepdad worked with legislatures to bring new policies to the state of Texas. I had not heard of this. Have you heard of the Clear Alert?
Nope.
Called the Clear Alert, the bill enacts that any time a person between the ages of 18 to 65 is reported missing, a large-scale text alert will go out to all Texas citizens to help spread awareness to bring that person home. Does that sound familiar to you?
It sounds like the Amber Alert, but why stop at age 65? Is there like
I'm not
something?
Sure.
You know what? Some states have something for older people as well. So I wonder
and that
if
might be
that's
the reason why.
Okay.
Yeah. But this does function just like an Amber Alert for adults. Yeah.
Okay.
And 18 is because that's what an Amber Alert would go up to. Correct. This bill was signed into law in September 2019, not long after the first mistrial. You know, it's interesting because we talk on Women in Crime all the time about how when a person goes missing and thought to be in danger, the first couple hours are the most critical.
Yes.
So I'd be curious to see if, what the impact of this type of legislation is.
That's the kind of policy that might be worth other states taking a look at also.
Yeah, depending on the impact, like I said. The Mandadi family also sued Trinity University on the grounds of negligence and equal protection claims, which I thought was interesting. Cayley's mother cited that Mark Howerton's abusive behavior was well known to Cayley's RAs, her athletic directors, and the police force. And after he trashed her room, the university, remember, forced her to take financial responsibility for the destruction, though she was clearly the victim of abuse. Her mother also claimed that at no point did anyone at the university reach out to help Cayley or offer her instruction or resources to help her get out of an abusive relationship, though many knew that Mark Howerton was abusive and had isolated her. Though the suit was filed in 2021, as of the time of this recording, it's not clear if there has been a resolution yet. However, there are currently no memorials or scholarships to Cayley Mandadi on Trinity University, which is likely due to the suit being ongoing. In the end, whether convicted of murder or not, Mark Howerton showed clear signs of being an abuser, from isolating Cayley and keeping her from her on-campus activities, to the violent behavior he exhibited in front of Cayley's friends. And his violence escalated very quickly over a short span of only 2 months, most likely brought on by jealousy that Cayley was still keeping in contact with her ex-boyfriend. I also want to point out that many people speculate that Mark's behavior was exacerbated by the steroids that he took, which I suspect is true.
Yeah.
And as far as I could find, Mark has never really shown any remorse for what happened to Cayley. In fact, after the mistrial, Mark took to social media on a frequent basis to gloat about the fact that he had beaten the system.
What?
Yes, Amy. At one point, he actually did a live video in which he said, quote, 70% of people think I'm guilty. Well, that's 70% of people who can suck my D. I'll let you fill in the blanks
I'm
there.
assuming he didn't say D, he said the actual word.
That's
Okay.
correct. Yeah, I'm just not going to.
Yeah, he needs to change that attitude if he wants to get paroled.
I mean, that was after the first mistrial, but he never issued any level of apology to the Mandadi family until, I'm sure you'll guess when, his sentencing in 2023. Now, Mark may not have meant to kill Cayley on that fateful car ride back to Houston, but his actions leading up to that point were in no way noble or in Cayley's best interest. Amy, you and I can only hope that Mark will find the rehabilitation he desperately needs in prison and become a productive citizen upon his eventual release, because he will be released someday. So we have to hope for the best here. Okay, if any of our listeners are experiencing or know someone who may be suffering from domestic abuse, there's help available. The National Domestic Abuse Hotline is 1-800-799-7233 and is a 24/7 line with operators speaking both English and Spanish. You can also visit thehotline.org for more information on how to be an advocate to identify potential domestic violence and how to help someone you know who may be in a domestic abuse situation.
Before we go today, if you'd like to support Campus Killings, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcasts.
Your subscription will get you VIP access to all the shows on the network that not only includes hundreds of episodes of ad-free listening, but also bonus content and early access to episodes.
For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, you'll unlock a variety of listener benefits, and you'll be supporting this show in the process.
Head over to Apple Podcasts and search for either Campus Killings or AbJack, and you can start your subscription with a free trial.
Your support is greatly appreciated.
Thank you, everyone, for listening today, and we hope you'll join us on the next episode of Campus Killings.
Campus Killings is hosted by Dr. Megan Sachs and Dr. Amy Schlossberg, with research and writing by Abigail Belcastro. It's produced by Mike Morford of AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to follow Campus Killings on social media. You can find Campus Killings on Twitter with the handle @CampusKillings or on Facebook at facebook.com/Campus Killings. You can also visit the show's homepage at campuskillings.com. Be sure to tune in every other Saturday for new episodes of Campus Killings.